The ego is the system that runs your sense of self. It is made out of thought patterns, emotions, and behavioral loops, and the stories that try to hold it all together. Left unchecked, it creates endless existential searching, chronic disconnection, and the persistent sense that something is wrong. The goal of my videos is clarity, to see your identity and its contradictions for what they are, named precisely, to finally understand what it is that we're all running away from. The biggest illusion about the nature of reality is that reality is some sort of illusion, that nothing is truly real as everything is an overlay of the mind. At some point in your investigative journey, you might have figured out that all reality is a model the brain creates in order to survive. And from there, you can see that all perception is subjective, and there's not really a truer perspective except of your own. And from this perspective, you can come into a sort of nihilistic, solipsistic groove where nothing matters but your own experience. But even your own experience is seen as empty underneath. The idea here is that there's no true reality because there are infinite perspectives reality can take. Therefore, everything is a hallucination made up from the perspective that you're taking. This realization can feel like coming in contact with some ultimate or absolute truth, and it can be extremely scary, even feel schizophrenic at times when you notice this for the first time. There's also a difference between an intellectual understanding of this idea and some actual ego dissolution that brings you to this realization. When it's just intellectual, it might remain just in the realm of philosophy and idea exchange. If it hits your nervous system and is felt into viscerally, then it can be a destabilizing sense for your entire identity. Because now it's not that you are not real, but all of reality is not real, and all your relationships are just a fabrication of your own mind. At a certain point, for a lot of people, this realization is actually crucial for their psychological development, because if they have a sense that their own ego is what reality is like, then they always see everything filtered through their own perception and cannot see that what is actually happening is that they are filtering a perception, and therefore it becomes real to them. So noticing how your mind filters stuff and seeing that to the core everything is fabricated can be extremely freeing, as it can also be destabilizing. What happens though is that we start to believe that therefore there is no truth whatsoever, that everything is an illusion, and since everything is an illusion, nothing matters. From there, a sort of nihilism can creep in, where you experience that nothing that you do has a real nature to it. There's not really happiness, but just the body processing chemicals that create the sense of happiness. There's not really love, but just the body processing the sense of love. You cannot get invested into movies so much because you see them all just a fabrication of some writing boardroom that made up the plot of this movie. You might feel that goals in your life stop mattering because it's all just a pretentious game between humans to accumulate wealth and have prestige in a society that values you to have a lot of money. From there, you might get very low in your sense of motivation for life because there seems to be no real purpose in anything, and all your creation of purpose is seen now as nothing but an internally created feeling. Now, from there, real, deeper, and more sincere awakening is also possible, because just staying at this level where everything is subjective and reality is a nihilistic illusion is a part of the truth, but it is not the end of the path. What happens is that if everything was just an illusion and reality is just a dream, then what are you waking up from when you have an awakening experience? What are all these religions and philosophies trying to point to when they are trying to point to the transcendent? If there's just this hallucination happening, then there cannot be anything to transcend this hallucination. Non-duality is the idea that all is one, and there's no true separation between anything. From there, the ego takes this idea and then believes itself to be everything that exists. So there's this weird contradiction that happens where on one side you believe reality is ultimately empty and nihilism reigns supreme, but at the same time, you are all that exists and you are constantly aware of the fact that you perceive experience and you perceive your own life. You might start to think that if reality is all an illusion, then why do you still experience stuff? If you still experience stuff, it means that something has to be happening rather than nothing. The illusion that this non-dual framework or no self understanding can lead you towards is to be disconnected from actual reality, from actual truthful perception. Just because everything is one or everybody hallucinates a sort of reality model doesn't mean that there is not some grounding reality underneath. It doesn't mean that science is wrong. It doesn't mean that other people don't have actual experience. Much in the contrary. Once you shift from this egoic obsession to make everything about oneself and create meaning from your own sense of purpose or personal narrative, and then once you see that everything is ultimately constructed by causes and conditionings, you can now see what have these causes and conditionings actually constructed. And for the matter of fact, they have constructed human civilization. They have constructed you as a human, a body with a beating heart, breathing lungs, and a nervous system that can feel pain. Every person or all of human history that has tried to figure out some sort of metaphysical truth or try to come closer to God or find the one true philosophy that unites everything, all does so because he wants to avoid or she wants to avoid the inescapable nature of pain. We are waking up to an existence that we haven't signed up for, and it forces us to experience pain. It is not something that we can actively decide, but it is just the case that as a human, you can go through an incredibly torturous amount of pain, both on the psychological side and on the physical side. And in fact, it is guaranteed that you will experience pain. So here is where the existential, psychological defense mechanism comes into play. Now you are born into a world where you have to experience pain, and there seems to be no escape out of it. So then you come up with an idea. God gave me purpose. I need to make the world a better place, or I need to pray to God in order for the world to have meaning. And then the entire religious paradigm to seek for something beyond you is a way to cope with the fact of pain. The same is true for non-dual traditions. Everything is one. Reality is an illusion. Nothing truly matters. All these are ways in order to cope with the inevitability of your own pain. And what true spirituality does is it sees the constructed nature of reality. It sees that everything is an illusion, but then looks honestly at the pain. That's why experiencing your own emotions is so important. They are exactly what every single person on this planet wants to avoid. You cannot escape your own existence. That's precisely the point. Everything is conditioned, and you are the thing now that is capable of experiencing everything that your life has shown you to be capable of experiencing. All spirituality is a way to cope with this pain. Now, there is some sort of solution that does matter a lot, and it is to the degree to which psychological pain is self-inflicted. You can differentiate between pain and suffering. And in the psychological sense, suffering is pain times resistance. When you experience something you don't want to experience, then you don't just experience pain, you suffer, because there's an organism that is now conditioned to move through emotion that is now resisting the emotion that is moving towards. So of course, the outcome is extremely dissonant. You're not in harmony with what is happening to you, but you're actively fighting against it. To a certain extent, this is natural, right? If somebody starts to poke you with a knife, you will flinch and react negatively. You will try to avoid it. And this is the entire structure that made us survive for millions of years in the first place. If it wasn't for pain, we wouldn't be having this conversation right now. You wouldn't be listening to my YouTube videos and you wouldn't be breathing, because we are constructed by pain. Everything the human race has done is thanks through pain. If not, the survival instinct wouldn't work at all. So pain is such a foundational aspect of every living being in existence, and at the same time, the human psychology looks at the amount of pain and thinks this shouldn't be possible. This should not be this intense or this horrible. Therefore, existence is a mistake, or I find some metaphysical solution in order to make it okay. It is all a psychological defense mechanism. All spirituality is a psychological defense mechanism. To a certain degree, it is highly, highly effective once you find a purpose with some higher being. When you see how much of reality is an illusion, you're starting to see how much it is constructed through your own conditionings. But it does not mean that you can escape from pain. What you can escape from is from your own suffering. The part of the mind that says, I don't want to experience this in a psychological sense, causes so much more suffering than you are aware of. And it is precisely this suffering that you can reduce to zero. This won't mean that you can actually avoid physical pain for the rest of your life. This is kind of the illusion modern teachings like Neo-Advaita kind of perpetuate, because people want to believe in a world where physical pain is impossible. Well, believing in this world is possible, but it is a lie. It is a lie the ego tells itself in order to believe there's some sort of spiritual transcendence in order to not feel the actual pain. But believe me when I tell you that moving through the pain will put you in a position where suffering ceases, where the sense that you don't want to be this, you don't want to be able to feel pain, you don't want to live in this human body. All of these sensations of unsatisfaction, boredom, sadness, anger, frustration, existential searching, all of these are aspects of experience that are not mandatory. You can move through your brain and through your nervous system in a way that you don't have to experience these things. There are a lot of layers of psychological and spiritual development, which, by the way, when I say psychological or spiritual development, I'm talking about the same thing. Just depending on your framework, you are more drawn to one framing or the other. But the solution is one and the same, because reality is one and the same. So for your psychological and spiritual development, there are certain aspects where you see through parts of reality, for example, through the elusive nature of your ego. But then people get stuck in some sort of new narrative, for example, believing that consciousness is the ultimate nature of reality, that consciousness is the ground of all existence. It's not that this is wrong or not coming in contact with truth, but then this metaphysical belief is a new belief in order to cope with pain. Now something bad happens and you hope that somehow all your spiritual practice or metaphysical knowledge will save you from the visceral brutality of physical reality. It might help, but it won't actually protect you. In fact, the more you cling to some sort of spiritual superiority, the more it's going to hurt when you notice, no, you still have not escaped a transcendent reality. The intention to try to escape is the precise thing that is keeping you suffering. To understand at which point you are in your psychological development, I've developed a protocol which I call my Ego Architecture Audit. You can read in the link in the description how I exactly proceed in this protocol and how I can tell where exactly you are in your own psychological development journey, where the knots are, where there are still restriction and resistance towards the nature of your own experience. Once you loosen these knots and understand where these knots lie, you can move through a life that is without suffering. It is not an illusion to live a life without suffering, as long as you define suffering as the psychological resistance towards discomfort. There's nothing more important than humanity can do right now but to investigate the nature of their own consciousness, to undersee what it is that is trying to escape from its own existence, how the ego constantly pretends to be above one's own reality model. True awakening, full understanding of what the nature of truth and consciousness and experience is like, makes you more human. It puts you more into your body and makes you experience reality more fully as a human being, not as some sort of transcendent spirit of consciousness that is untouched by reality. This is a defense mechanism in order to suppress negative emotions. Feel all your negative emotions deeper, and you will feel life deeper, and you will become closer in contact to truth. This is also the case for not being so intellectually minded. I was very obsessed with figuring out truth on a philosophical term, kind of distracting myself from all of the pain that I was experiencing internally, when all the philosophical seeking clearly was about my own pain. It is all about suffering at the end of the day, and to acknowledge that there is something to move towards and dissolve in your own relationship to life is what brings you long-term and lasting peace.